It was supposed to be just another peaceful afternoon in a quiet suburban neighborhood. The sun was shining, kids were playing in their yards, and everything seemed normal until it wasn't. In just a matter of minutes, an encounter between a highly respected U.S. Army major and three police officers turned into a shocking and deeply disturbing incident that would shake the community and spark outrage across the nation. What happened on that day was more than just a misunderstanding. It was an alarming display of abuse of power, racism, and disrespect for someone who had dedicated their life to serving the country. And it was all caught on camera. The Army major, a decorated officer with years of service, had just parked her car in front of a friend's house. She was still in her uniform, the proud insignia on her chest reflecting her years of dedication and sacrifice. But instead of being treated with the respect she had earned, she found herself face to face with three aggressive police officers, their hands resting on their weapons, their voices filled with hostility. She had done nothing wrong. There was no crime, no reason for suspicion, but that didn't seem to matter. At first, it was just words. Sharp, cutting insults disguised as authority. The officers questioned her presence in the neighborhood, their tones laced with condescension. They didn't see a soldier. They didn't see a woman who had sworn to protect the very freedoms they claimed to uphold. All they saw was someone they felt didn't belong. The major remained calm, trying to de-escalate the situation with reason and professionalism. But the officers weren't interested in a conversation. Their taunts turned into threats, and before she knew it, one of them had drawn his gun, aiming it directly at her. Neighbors began to step outside, alarmed by the escalating confrontation. A few started recording, their phones capturing the shocking reality of what was unfolding. The major stood her ground, refusing to be intimidated, but she knew how dangerous the situation had become. One wrong move, one misinterpreted gesture, and things could turn deadly. She raised her hands, her voice steady but firm. She reminded them of her rank, her service, her rights. But the officers only seemed to grow more aggressive, their arrogance fueled by their unchecked authority. And then sirens. More police officers arrived, responding to the growing commotion. Among them was a commanding officer who quickly assessed the situation. He saw the gun still pointed at the major, the growing crowd, the disbelief on people's faces. Something had gone terribly wrong, and it was clear that the officers involved had crossed a line that couldn't be ignored. What happened next would lead to an internal investigation, national headlines, and ultimately, the firing of the three officers. But how did it all unfold? What were the consequences of their actions? And most importantly, what does this incident reveal about the deep-rooted issues within law enforcement today? Stay tuned as we break down the full story, uncover the truth, and hear directly from those who witnessed this shocking abuse of power firsthand. The silence that followed was thick with tension. The commanding officer stepped forward, his eyes shifting between the Army major, who stood tall despite the danger she had just faced, and the three officers who now looked uneasy. The crowd had grown larger, neighbors murmuring in disbelief, some shaking their heads, while others kept their phones raised, capturing every moment. The weight of what had just happened was undeniable. A soldier, a woman who had sworn to protect her country, had been humiliated and threatened at gunpoint. For what? The answer to that question hung in the air, unspoken but understood. The major's hands were still raised slightly, a reflex from the moments before when she had been staring down the barrel of a gun. She took a slow breath, steadying herself, but she didn't back down. She met the commanding officer's gaze and spoke clearly, her voice carrying both authority and restrained anger. "I am Major Danielle Foster, United States Army. These officers just aimed a weapon at me without cause. I demand an explanation." The crowd hushed, waiting for what would come next. The officers in question exchanged glances, their confidence from moments ago fading. One of them, a sergeant with graying hair and a clenched jaw, scoffed and shook his head. "We were just following procedure," he muttered, but there was no conviction in his words. Another officer shifted uncomfortably, his hand still resting near his holster as if unsure what to do next. The third, the one who had actually pointed the gun, avoided eye contact entirely, his fingers flexing nervously at his sides. The commanding officer wasn't convinced. His expression darkened as he turned toward the sergeant. What exactly was the procedure here? His voice was sharp, cutting through the tension. Because from where I'm standing, it looks like an abuse of power. The sergeant straightened, his jaw tightening further. She was acting suspicious, he said, but his words rang hollow. The major didn't let him continue. Suspicious, she repeated, her tone laced with disbelief. I was standing outside my car in uniform. I wasn't trespassing, I wasn't committing a crime. The only thing suspicious here is why 3 armed officers thought I was a threat. The sergeant opened his mouth as if to argue, but the commanding officer raised a hand, stopping him. By now, more police cars had arrived, and officers who hadn't been part of the initial confrontation were gathering information from witnesses. Several neighbors stepped forward, eager to share what they had seen. She didn't do anything, one man said, shaking his head. They just rolled up and started harassing her. A woman, still holding her phone, nodded in agreement. They were shouting at her from the start. It was wrong. The weight of the situation was growing heavier by the second. The officers who had been so bold just minutes ago were now realizing that their actions were not going to be brushed aside. The video evidence, the witnesses, and the major's own testimony were all working against them. Yet, despite everything, they still refused to acknowledge what they had done. The commanding officer took a step closer to them, his voice quieter now, but no less firm. We're going to get to the bottom of this, he said. And if what I'm hearing is true, there will be consequences. The 3 officers remained silent, their faces unreadable. But deep down, they had to know their time was running out. What would happen next? Would justice be served? Or would this be yet another case that got swept under the rug? The world was watching now, and the truth was about to come out. Back at the police station, tension filled the air like a storm waiting to break. The 3 officers sat in a conference room, their expressions shifting between frustration and fear. They had been pulled off duty pending an investigation, and they knew things weren't looking good. The video of the encounter was already spreading online, and the department's leadership wasn't taking this lightly. The commanding officer, now seated at the head of the table, watched them in silence for a moment before finally speaking. You need to understand the gravity of what you did today, he said, his voice steady but sharp. This isn't going away. The army is involved. The media is involved. The public is watching, and I need answers. Meanwhile, Major Danielle Foster sat in a quiet room across the station, her hands resting in her lap as she recounted the events to an internal affairs investigator. She had dealt with hostility before. She had faced dangers far worse in combat zones. But this felt different. This wasn't about a battlefield or a foreign threat. This was home, and the people who were supposed to serve and protect had turned their weapons on her without a second thought. The investigator, a woman with tired eyes but a sharp mind, nodded as she took notes. Did they ever explain why they stopped you? She asked. The sergeant, the oldest of the 3, leaned forward, folding his arms tightly across his chest. She was being difficult, he muttered. She had an attitude. The commanding officer's expression hardened. An attitude. He shook his head in disbelief. That's your justification for pulling a gun on a decorated U.S. Army major, for insulting her, for treating her like a criminal. One of the younger officers shifted uncomfortably in his seat. We thought she was trespassing, he said, but even he didn't sound convinced. The commanding officer sighed, rubbing his temples. You didn't check her ID. You didn't ask questions. You went straight to aggression. Do you even realize what you've done? He let the question hang in the air before adding, you may have just ended your careers. Danielle exhaled slowly. They never gave me a real reason, she said. Just accusations, assumptions, and insults. She paused before adding, one of them kept calling me girl, like I was some nobody off the street, like my uniform meant nothing. The investigator's lips pressed into a thin line. "That's not something we take lightly," she said. "And the video, it's bad." Danielle had already seen part of it. The way the officer had shouted at her, his gun pointed in her face. The way the others stood by, smirking, refusing to intervene. Even now, replaying it in her head, she could feel the sting of humiliation and anger. But she wasn't just angry for herself. She was angry for every person who had ever been treated like this, who didn't have a camera recording or a uniform to shield them from worse. Outside the station, the story was growing. News outlets were picking up the footage, activists were demanding action, and community leaders were calling for an immediate response. The department was scrambling, knowing this wasn't something they could ignore. Protesters had already gathered outside, their voices rising in the evening air, demanding justice. Back inside, the three officers sat in silence, the weight of their choices pressing down on them. They had always believed they were untouchable, that their badges would protect them. But now, for the first time, they weren't so sure. The pressure inside the police station was growing by the second. The commanding officer had just left the interrogation room where the three officers sat, and now they were alone with their thoughts. The sergeant drummed his fingers against the table, his frustration barely concealed. He had spent years on the force, believing he knew how things worked, believing that situations like this could be brushed under the rug. But this time, it was different. There was video evidence, public outrage, and an army major who wasn't backing down. The younger officer, the one who had barely spoken during the incident, finally broke the silence. His voice was low, uncertain. "Do you think we're really going to get fired?" The sergeant shot him a look. "You think this is about our jobs? This is bigger than that." His voice dropped, suddenly filled with a rare trace of concern. "This is about what happens next. Investigations, lawsuits, maybe even charges." That word, charges, made them all stiffen. It wasn't just their careers on the line anymore. If the department decided to make an example out of them, they could be facing legal consequences. The weight of what they had done was finally setting in. Meanwhile, in another part of the station, Major Danielle Foster sat quietly as the investigator finished, taking her statement. Her face remained composed, but her hands were clenched together tightly. She had been in intense situations before, but this was different. This wasn't a battlefield where the enemy was clear. This was home, and the people who were supposed to uphold the law had turned against her. The investigator leaned forward. "Major Foster, I need to ask you something directly. Do you want to press charges?" Danielle's eyes flickered with emotion, but she didn't answer immediately. She could hear the muffled sounds of people gathering outside, the voices of protesters demanding accountability. Her phone had been buzzing non-stop, calls from fellow soldiers, friends, even strangers offering their support. This wasn't just about her anymore. This was about something bigger. Before she could respond, the sound of raised voices erupted from the hallway. The commanding officer's sharp tone cut through the noise. "This is not up for debate. The video is damning. The reports are damning. The entire department is under a microscope right now, and I will not allow this to be ignored." Danielle turned her head slightly, listening. Another voice, angrier, followed. "So that's it. We're just going to let a decorated officer ruin our careers." The commanding officer's voice was cold. "No, you ruined your own careers." The officer swallowed hard, looking toward the one-way mirror as if afraid someone was listening. Those two officers who left, they didn't just run because of this investigation. He hesitated before finally saying they ran because they know something that could bring the whole department down. Danielle felt the weight of his words sink in. The confrontation, the insults, the gun in her face, had it all been part of something deeper, something darker? Outside, the sounds of the protest grew louder. But inside this room, the real battle was just beginning. Danielle stared at the young officer, her mind racing. His words carried weight, and she could see the fear in his eyes. Whatever those two officers were running from, it wasn't just public outrage. It was something far bigger. The investigator leaned in. "If you have something to say, now is the time." The officer hesitated, glancing toward the door as if expecting someone to barge in at any moment. Then finally he spoke. "They were warned," he said. "Before they walked out. Someone tipped them off that things were about to get worse for them. Someone high up." Danielle's stomach clenched. "You're saying there's a cover-up?" The officer gave a slow nod. "Not just for this. For other things. This isn't the first time something like this has happened." His voice dropped lower. "But this time they messed up. They didn't expect you to fight back. They didn't expect the video to go viral. And now the department is scrambling to control the damage." The investigator exchanged a look with the commanding officer, who had been listening quietly. His jaw was tight, his face unreadable. Then he sighed, rubbing his temple. "We need to find them. Fast." Danielle could see it in his face, the realization that he had been betrayed. The same system that had protected them, encouraged them, even allowed them to act without consequences, had just turned its back on them. He wasn't an officer anymore. He was a loose end. The official took a slow step forward. "Put the gun down," he ordered. His voice was calm, but there was an edge to it, a warning. For a split second, the standing officer's hand twitched, like he was considering making a move, but he knew it was over. With a heavy exhale, he lowered his weapon and placed it on the ground. Officers rushed in, securing both men in cuffs. The scene was over almost as quickly as it had escalated, but the weight of what had just happened still pressed on everyone. Danielle stood up from behind the police car, watching as the commanding officer gave orders. The high-ranking official turned, meeting her gaze for the first time. There was something unreadable in his eyes. He knew that she knew, but instead of saying anything, he simply nodded at the commanding officer and walked away, disappearing into the night like none of this had ever happened. The next few days were a whirlwind. The news spread fast. 2 officers arrested, a third turning witness, and mounting pressure on the department to address deep-rooted corruption. Protests continued, not just for Danielle, but for countless others who had been silenced before her. The young officer who had confessed sat in front of a grand jury, revealing everything he knew. His testimony opened doors to investigations far beyond just this case. Officers who had once been untouchable now faced scrutiny, and suddenly, the weight of accountability was real. Danielle sat at her desk one evening, reading messages from strangers, people who had seen the video, who had followed the case, who felt like justice had finally started to take shape. But it wasn't victory. Not yet. The system that allowed this to happen was still there. It would take more than one case, more than one viral video, to fix what was broken. She glanced at her uniform hanging in the closet, the one she had worked so hard to earn. Being in the army meant discipline, structure, service. But it also meant something more to her now, responsibility. Not just to her country, but to the people who needed voices like hers to stand up and refuse to be silenced. As she stepped outside into the cool evening air, she could still hear the echoes of protests in the distance. Change was slow, but it was coming. And this time, people were finally paying attention.